Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this monthly policy update. I'm Micah Nelson with Independent Sector. Today, we'll be joined by my IS colleagues, Ben Kershaw and Ana Montañez, as well as Wes Coulomb and Jessica Cameron with Washington Counsel, Ernst & Young. As part of our webinar feature, all lines are currently muted, and we will pause periodically for questions. To ask questions, please type in the chat box. Specifically, that's the chat box and not the Q&A box, or email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. We look forward to your questions today and appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, Micah. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm really glad to have you all with us. As long as people can hear me, I'm sure people will chat if they see my talking head and cannot hear me. Thank you for being with us today. As Micah mentioned, we have our colleagues with Washington Counsel, Ernst & Young, and we even have their pretty pictures up on a slide for you all. As is the new universe, we're working through some technical difficulties, so we will see if they are able to join us. Again, thank you for joining this afternoon. So we're going to spend probably the entirety of our time this afternoon talking about the COVID-19 relief efforts that have made their way through Congress, including most of our time on the one that is still making its way through. So a quick overview of that for you now on the next slide. So again, to recap, two pieces of legislation responding to COVID-19 have already been signed into law. We should note that, you know, for Congress, this is pretty quick work in and of itself. $8.3 billion that was signed into law, you know, really just as the federal government was starting to recognize the gravity of the situation we confront. That focused on vaccine development, public health, and preparedness. Some portions of it did focus on international affairs as well, something that the international nonprofit community was calling for and calling for more of. Just over a week ago, a second piece of legislation was signed into law in the range of $100 billion worth of response. That provision was the first real victory that we've seen for the nonprofit sector in these response efforts, specifically because the paid leave mandates and the payroll tax credits that accompanied that legislation were structured in a way that allowed nonprofits to participate. We have often seen nonprofits in prior legislation excluded because they don't pay income taxes. So this was sort of a sign of I think the sector's mobilization and a sign that the sector was going to be at the table. That bill also included additional Medicaid funding, testing for uninsured individuals, and some federal appropriations as well. And so continuing, since that legislation has been signed into law, we now see this Kerrs Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. We will get into the particulars of these provisions, but before I talk a little bit about Independent perspective on the bill and what we at IS and we all collectively have been working towards, did want to paste a very brief overview of what's in this bill. You know, really significant assistance through the Small Business Administration, even larger numbers in assistance through the Department of the Treasury. The unemployment insurance system is a major investment that this bill is making. And from the numbers that we saw come out this morning, I think we're all really glad to see that that system, which will be facing tremendous burden, is getting some investment. assistance to state, tribal, and local governments, as well as direct payments to individuals and to families. Those confront income limitations of roughly, they phase out completely when people hit $99,000 for individuals and $198,000 for married couples. But most Americans, 90% of Americans, will be receiving reasonably large, compared to prior federal direct assistance efforts, direct payments. And so independent sector has had a particular perspective in advocating on this issue as well. We, joined by many colleagues in the charitable sector, have been asking Congress in the Kerrs Act to provide expressly $60 billion in emergency funding for our sector. We asked for a robust, universal charitable deduction, understanding it may be time limited, but that the sector was going to face tremendous demand, lost revenue, and at the very best, uncertain charitable giving environment. We have also been working really hard to ensure that all nonprofits qualified for, in particular, loans through the Small Business Administration. There were provisions in an earlier bill that banned organizations with more than 500 employees and banned Medicaid recipient organizations from participating. More on that in a little bit. Independent sector also was working to increase funding provided to secure our elections. We believe that elections are at the core of a healthy civil society, and that funding will be necessary to confront, transforming our elections so that everyone can vote safely and confidently this year. Before we dive into a little bit more specifics on the bill, I'll point out that as is evidenced by the number of folks I think on this event today, the nonprofit sector has been tremendously engaged. And I think that it's important to pause and recognize that this is why we were at the table when this bill was being hashed out in the final hours. Over 200 national nonprofit organizations on a community letter, thousands of endorsements for a particular bipartisan amendment in the Senate to increase the caps on the above the line deduction that, again, we will talk about, as well as just in our own little slice of the world, one particular Action Center campaign in the Independent Sector Action Center generated that 38,000 number that folks see on the screen was the latest. It's gone up since then. That is many times more than our Action Center generated all of last year. And we don't pretend to be anywhere near the only people who've been galvanizing grassroots advocates on this effort. So there certainly has been an outpouring of interest and voice from the sector. So we think that's important. I understand that a colleague, Wes, at least, has joined us. And so before I turn things over to him, I do just want to emphasize one more thing on the next slide. And that is that this monthly gathering is usually a members only gathering. This month, that's not the case because we think it is so vitally important to all be joining together in these efforts. But if you're interested in the information that you're about to hear about the context and the really important content that will shape, maybe the future of the nonprofit sector, if you think this is fun and you want to do it every month, we would love to have you continue to join us every month as a member. And you can find out more at independentsector.org/membership. I know our folks would love to hear from you. And so now I'm really happy to turn it over to Wes Coulomb with Washington Counsel Ernst & Young. Wes is going to walk us through some of the particulars of the Kerrs Act as it sits now. Wes, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ben. You hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Good. Thanks. I'll go through basically just 4 of the areas or programs within the larger bill that is passed the Senate yesterday and is teed up to be considered by the Senate, by the House tomorrow. As Ben kind of laid out, the bill is large in scope, large in dollar amounts. There's a lot in there, but we're going to kind of focus on 4 targeted programs that the nonprofit sector can take advantage of as part of this this new relief effort that Congress is working through. First is on slide 8. You talk about is the Paycheck Protection Program. It is a program that is going to be administered by the Small Business Administration through their what is called their 7A loan program. It allows them to guarantee 100% of the amount of a loan that is given through a bank or financial institution to a small business or a nonprofit organization. The qualifications for this is a 501c3 nonprofit can get a loan through this 7A Paycheck Protection Program and is available to those who have 500 employees or less. The attribution rules, affiliation rules would apply to consolidate your various organizations into one for purposes of that 500 employee limit. And also under that program, you have a maximum loan size of 2.5 times the amount of your payroll costs for the average monthly payroll costs for the past year is what the maximum loan would be. It'd be that amount or the greater of the lesser of that, or $10 million is the max loan they would provide to any organization. Interesting enough, this program also allows you to get a portion of that loan forgiven. So if you maintain your employment during the 8-week period in which you get the loan, once you get the loan, there's an 8-week testing period to test whether you're maintaining your employment compared to your employment you had in 2019, basically the period from February to June of 2019. And if you maintain your employment, then 100% of the amount of that loan that you spent on payroll costs, mortgage interest costs, rent, and utilities would be forgiven and basically turned into a grant as part of this program. So this is a big benefit to nonprofits who need some financial support during this time. And the program is available to you to take access through your bank from now until June 30th of this year. So it's a short-term program available to nonprofits. A loan program basically turned into a grant through loan forgiveness. Okay, let's go on to the next program that is available on slide 9. Also is a program through the SBA agency, and it's basically an emergency economic injury grants or also loans. There's a disaster loan program through the SBA, a little bit in the 7A program that I just talked about, and you can apply for a disaster loan through the SBA. Nonprofits as well who have 500 employees or less get a $10,000 grant for that program. Not payable back even if your application denied as that program. You get basically that $10,000 within 3 days of applying for your disaster or economic injury disaster loan program. And that if you get that grant, however, it count against your loan you got, the forgiveness you received in the 7A program that we just talked about. That's available to nonprofit employers as well. And that application process, I think, runs longer through the remainder of 2020 as well, that grant program. Not as large, but $10,000 as a grant is something, quick money out the door to nonprofits. Okay.
Hey, Wes, we've had a couple questions come in about this. First, maybe just a very specific question. That 500 employee limit, we know that SBA takes a pretty expansive definition of an employee, including part-time employees, but does it also include employees located outside the United States? Do you know?
It would not. It would only apply to employees in the United States.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And the other issue that I know people will be interested to hear more about, we've heard some questions by email as well. You mentioned the SBA affiliation rules applying to the Paycheck Protection Program. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know this is kind of uncharted territory a little bit.
Yeah, so in the past, nonprofits have been able to get disaster loans through the 7B program, the SBA, but not this new 7A loan program. Under that program, basically the affiliation rules try to prevent a large organization by saying, well, I have a small operation here that has 400 employees, even though their overall employment might be 5,000 employees. And so what it does is basically it says that if you have entities that control or related, for example, one entity controls another entity, or there's some sort of licensing arrangements or certain other arrangements, they have crossover of their boards or management. There's very detailed rules the SBA has for that purpose, and it basically tries to prevent large employers from breaking down their business into small businesses and applying for those small business loans. So that's been in the books for a long time as part of the SBA program, and so those would apply to this program for nonprofits. And so you have to kind of go through those rules to see if you were close to or above the 500 employee limit. You want to kind of go through those rules to see if what part of your organization would be considered affiliated or not.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's go back there. So any other questions on the injury grants? If not, we'll kind of skip on to the third program. That's the Treasury Loan Program. Or actually, no, I think we're talking about the employee retention credits. Yeah, sorry, I skipped ahead too much. All right, also, the employee retention credits were included in this package. This provision has been used in the past. Various disaster relief bills that Congress has passed over the years to deal with hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. And basically, the employee retention credit is a credit for an employer to retain their employees. If there is, for example, your operation is out, inoperable, or you can't access your operation or your office, then they want you to maintain your employment and keep your employees on the payroll. And if you do that, you get a tax credit for the amount of wages you pay those employees, even though they're not coming to work on a regular basis or during the period in which the disaster occurred. So these would be expanded in this case to include, obviously, the COVID-19 disaster that the president has declared, and basically provide a tax credit for 50% of wages up to $10,000 per employee. So basically, a maximum credit of $5,000 is refundable against the employer's in payroll or employment taxes that you pay for your employees. Anything above that amount would be refundable, and so you get a check if your payroll taxes exceeded that amount. So you take $10,000 per employee, how many employees you have, take half of that, and that would be your credit for the purposes of this employee retention credit, which you must maintain your employees during the period in which the credit is available. And it would only apply to wages paid to employees from March 12th until December 31st of this year. Maintain your employment and kept them on the books, you get a tax credit under these terms for the wages you pay these employees you retained and to let go or fire as part of the process. Now, any amount you receive under the 7A loan program that we just talked about, the Paycheck Protection Program, would not be eligible for the credit. You couldn't get both. It's both the credit and the 7A loan program forgiveness on the same amount of wages that you paid. So you basically had to pick one or the other and not both. Okay.
Got it.
And the last program I want to talk about, unless there's a question on that one, Ben?
No, I think we'll circle back. There are a lot of integrated questions.
Yep, sure. So the last program out there is a program through the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. Basically, a $500 billion loan fund and part of that is going to the airlines and the air cargo industry. And then about 450 billion of that is for kind of a broad-based loan program for the broader economy, for businesses, case of organizations that have 500 to 10,000 employees, nonprofit organizations would be able to access this loan program. Details not as quite set out because it's a new program through the Treasury Department, available through now until the end of December. So basically a full year program. It would be direct loans for the most part through the Treasury Department, and the interest rate would be capped at 2%, whereas the SBA program I talked about before was capped at 4%. It's a bit less interest, but there's no ability to forgive these loans. They can be deferred for 6 months, but it would not be no forgiveness on this loan program. You also must show that you're retaining 90% of your workforce at their full compensation September 30th of this year, 2020, in order to qualify for the loan program. So that's kind of the basics of what's available. There'll be more details coming out from both Treasury and SBA on these various programs as the time goes by. I just want to turn to Jessica on see if she has any other comments or anything to add to the outline I just laid out.
Hey, Wes, and thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, I think Wes did a great summary. The one thing I will add is that what we've seen with this latest stimulus package is that things came together rather quickly in not only putting it together, but also in its passage. And so I really credit the charitable sector not only for its work, in the days leading up to it, but I will say that a big part of that and a big part of why there are a lot of great provisions in this recent stimulus package that affect nonprofits is because of the work leading up in the months before the coronavirus was a lot of work in dealing with not only the universal charitable deduction, but also other provisions that are in this bill. And so I think that just gives a testament of not only that work, but also the work, before we kind of started with all of the work that was done here. I'll let Ben kind of talk about anything you'd like to talk about there, but wanted to point that out as provisions that are in this bill that weren't necessarily new, but things that we had been talking about before the bill had come up for a debate.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, yes, there is something that comes to mind. And before we move on to that, we have a few more minutes for Q&A here. We'll try to save some time at the end to circle back for general Q&A, which I think may also center heavily on some of the SBA programs. But for now, I would remind people to please submit questions through the chat function, just because that's the only one I have open on my screen right now. So there's a question about, is the employee retention credit applicable to nonprofits? And so that I would answer that one by saying yes, because that credit is on payroll taxes, which even though they are tax exempt, nonprofits pay those taxes. A couple other questions. Is there an employee number cap for the employee retention credit? And I believe there is not on that one. Is that correct, Washington Council? It's $5,000 per employee, a max?
Correct. That is correct. There's no employee cap. Obviously, you need to show that the employees that you're counting for this credit were unable to work in the suspended period during, due to COVID-19. There is different treatment versus 100 employees or less versus 100 employees or more. We're going to have you count the wages, but there's no overall employment cap versus the tax credit.
Got it. So we're getting a few questions that I think are about the timing of reductions in employment. If people have already reduced employees and how hiring them back would either make them eligible or not for these portions of the, of the SBA loan forgiveness. Could you walk us through a little bit about how the timing aspect of those work, whether it's, all of 2019 or as of today or earlier this month?
Yeah, so for the SBA loan program, basically it's treated, the loan forgiveness piece of it, for example, is counting your payroll costs during an 8-week period from when you originate the loan. So let's say you get the loan on April 1st, then basically look at your 8-week period, basically the months of April and May, to count the amount of payroll costs you incurred during that period, and then that would be kind of the amount you could get forgiven for the loan.
Got it. And there's a maximum salary per individual that can be forgiven as well. Is that right?
Correct. Only for purposes of the employee calculation, the qualified, you'd only take into account up to $100,000 wages or salary, for purposes of the payroll cost calculation, and also for purposes of treating them as an employee for purposes of the calculation for qualified employees.
Okay. Great. And one more question from our standing partners at BoardSource. Are organizations with reserves eligible for these loans, or is this only available to organizations that have, kind of spent down all of their reserves?
Nope, there would not be a reserve, criteria, if you will. So they would be qualified for it as long as they met the other criteria in the bill: the employee, 500 employees, and the payroll costs, etc., and retention of employees. Reserves would not come into play. The balance sheet would not come into play. This program.
Okay, great. And so last question about before we move on, the emergency grant of up to $10,000, that gets turned around in 3 days. Does that money comes directly from SBA? Is that correct? People don't have to go through a bank for those purposes.
Yeah, that would be through a bank as well.
So that is through a bank? It's either or.
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
In the past, they've done direct loans to the SBA on the disaster loan program, but in this case, it would be through a lender.
Great. Okay. We've gotten many more questions than we have time to answer. We are keeping a list of all the questions that we do answer and that we do not answer, and we'll be doing our best to work through that. I will just note that the engagement number, the engagement from the sector that our small staff has seen on this has been tremendously gratifying, but also tremendously humbling. So we will do our best to work through all of those questions. I want to move on now to another key piece of the Kerrs Act, charitable giving incentives in the sections noted for folks who are on the webinar 2204 and 5. So the text of the bill calls this an above the line deduction, but it is available only to people who do not otherwise itemize their deductions. Independent sector and many of our colleagues, as Jessica so well put it, have been advocating for a long time that every American ought to be able to claim the charitable deduction, whether they itemize or not. This cap of $300 is a real concern to us. It severely limits the ability of this provision to help charities and nonprofits to meet the urgency of this moment and the need in this moment. With that said, the fact that come tomorrow morning, a bill making any sort of charitable deduction available to every American will be, past Congress and on its way to being signed into law is something that we're really excited about stepping back. We will continue advocating to improve that provision in future legislation. I will note that deduction is only available for contributions of cash, and donations to donor-advised funds and supporting organizations are not eligible. This is a one-year provision that is applicable only to donations made in 2020. The other charitable giving incentive that the bill enacted is that it suspended the existing limitations of how much of your income you can give away to charity and still claim a deduction for it. So that GI limitation for cash contributions is now completely eliminated for 2020 for individuals, and it is increased up to 25% for corporations. The maximum food inventory deduction is also increased up to 25%. So those are two provisions that we will be watching closely. That independent sector advocated, loudly for them to be improved over the course of the legislative process over the last week, and they were not substantively improved, but we're excited to have them. Now I want to turn to Ana Montañez on our team to walk us through another really, really important piece of this bill that, to be honest, did not get as much attention in the press. So Ana, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. So yes, so I'm just going to give an overview of the appropriation highlights that are of interest for the nonprofit sector. So at the top for everyone via the webinar on Zoom, those 400 million for election assistance is funding for states to help them adapt their election procedures in order for them to comply to the CDC recommended practices. We know that voting serves as the cornerstone of our healthy civil society, and that is very important. We know at independent sector that additional funding is going to be necessary in order to comply with those guidelines. So this is something that if there comes another package, we will be looking out in order to have a healthy democracy for 2020. Among other appropriation highlights are the child nutrition programs, who are getting $8.8 billion to expand funding for food purchases and increase flexibility for schools. Another important appropriation is for the supplemental nutrition assistance programs known as SNAP. This actually allows to cover the waivers granted in the previous package passed in the House and in the Senate, and it also anticipates the increase in demand due to the coronavirus outbreak. I would say something incredibly important here is the Emergency Food Assistance Program, $450 million. This bill allows additional funding for commodities and distribution of emergency food assistance through community partners, including food banks. I know that a lot of nonprofits actually are in the front line, so that's very important for them serving their communities. Another important appropriation of $453 million, it's for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the coronavirus containment, also aid for tribal governments, as well as tribal welfare assistance and social services program. In the next slide, we have $1 billion for the community services block grant. that actually allowed community-based organizations to provide a wide range of social services and emergency assistance for those who are most in need. Then I would say very important is the 75 million that each of the national endowments for the arts and the humanities got. So this is funding that will go through, to the states, so they can, to the state cultural councils and also arts councils, provide grants for their partner organizations and ensure that communities have access to culture as well as arts during these times. I would say 50 million for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and that is mostly for digital access and technical support services. Something that is very important these days that actually got noted into these appropriations is the national funding 2 million for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which it's a crucial service, especially during these days that everyone it's at home. So yeah, I would say, and I don't want to leave without mentioning the appropriation of 25 million for the runaway and homeless youth programs. This is additional additional aid to current programs providing critical services and housing for runaways and homeless youth. So if anyone has any questions about this.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So we did have one question that I would look to, I might look to Washington Council on. Do the SNAP provisions suspend the broad categorical eligibility changes by USDA last year, which would allow for more people to be eligible? My impression was that that this bill did not touch those.
Ben, this is Wes. Anna might not have a better.
Okay, we'll look into that.
I got show. I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll look into that.
I believe that on the previous package passed by the House, those were suspended.
Okay. Okay. We have another question / comment from our colleague, from a colleague, saying that on charitable giving incentives, the real opportunity, or a great opportunity, could be, as Congress maybe confronts a fourth bill, to apply some of these universal charitable deductions retroactively, or even to allow contributions made this year to count on last year's taxes, which, as we all know, have now been delayed by 3 months. So just one of our colleagues pointing out that could be a really valuable opportunity as well. We also have a question, and I know this is also maybe slightly outside of Washington Council's wheelhouse, but are people on Social Security or Social Security disability, do folks know if they're eligible to receive the direct funds that were mentioned, the $1,200 per person? Have people seen clarification on that?
Yes, this is Jessica. That's correct. So how the language is worded for the recovery checks is that they will base the income limitations first on the individual's 2019 returns, and then if not on 2018 returns. However, there also are provisions in the bill that if for those individuals that do not file a tax return for either of those 2 years, other means by which to provide those checks to those individuals. So those individuals would be provided for with that recovery check.
Great, thank you, Jessica. One more question for you all. On where I know the legislative text says contributions that are made in cash. does that encompass any cash equivalents? Or do contributions have to be made truly in cash?
If you made in cash, so if you're thinking of cash equivalents like securities,
Yeah.
bonds, and that would be considered property and not considered cash for this purpose.
Okay. Even publicly traded. Okay. Great. So I'd like to pause to see Washington Council or any of my colleagues have anything else to add on this before we turn back to some of the many questions that we are sifting through on the SBA programs. And I apologize that I have to sift these a little bit in real time, but I will keep working through them. We really appreciate it. So anything else from Washington Council while we look at these?
This is Wes. The only thing I'd add is that obviously you went through the timing and the Senate already passed it. The House is supposed to pass it tomorrow. President signed the law very quickly. We would expect the SBA, the Treasury Department, et cetera, to get out guidance fairly quickly on these programs to help give people some guidance, given that they're kind of trying to get up and running and getting money out the door to people as soon as possible. So, I think the best thing to do is to watch for that guidance. Obviously, IS will be very helpful in trying to get people information as it comes out. The SBA loan go to the SBA itself. The local lender will have the details about making these 7(a) loans.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So why don't we turn to the next slide, and I will just note on this next slide sort of where we are. So this legislation passed the Senate last night amidst, I would say, substandard social distancing by our United States senators. There were a lot of them standing very close to each other while voting, but they did all vote for this bill. And the House of Representatives will convene at 9 a.m. tomorrow, after which point they will vote on the bill. We have every expectation that something that passes 96-0 in the Senate is a good bet to also pass the House of Representatives. But we think it is also really important that the sector get on record, not just in support of this critical aid, but as an important reminder that we know there will at least be negotiations over a fourth bill starting soon, and that legislators need to be reminded that the nonprofit sector needs to be at that table as well. So those of you who are in our email system received a blast from us asking you to call your legislators yesterday afternoon. We are now focusing just on the House of Representatives as that bill has passed the Senate. So I hope you will check out the Independent Sector Action Center and call your representatives today. I want to talk about the fourth bill because, as sort of even before the ink was dry on Bill 3, we've seen some legislators talking about Bill 4 negotiations start today. We've seen other legislators pumping the brakes on that idea and suggesting that we need to give this bill a chance to work first before we contemplate further needs. So Wes and Jessica, what is your sense about how legislators will approach a fourth bill over the next week and coming weeks?
Well, first they're going to be out, I think, until April 20th. So they'll be back in session until the end of April to get in Congress. So it's going to take some time before they get back to work on that. I'm sure we'll be already started to work on the legislation right now. I imagine there's going to be some changes to this bill that could kind of pass so quickly. There'll be some technical changes they want to fix to it, to fix it. Probably some other changes to some of the programs. We see how the economy is doing at that time. Is there areas where they need more spending, more relief? Is something working or not working? It's kind of like their sense is going to be. So I think there's going to be lots of different options on the table here for what they need to do. I don't think that the fourth bill will be as expansive as this one with $2 trillion in spending and loan programs. But, I think at that time they'll reassess kind of where the economy is, where employers are people getting back to work or not? What's the how's the virus been trending? I think that's really kind of what they're thinking about is do we need more? People already think we do need more. The question is how much and where do we need to target it? So I think a lot of conversation taking place in the next couple of weeks on that.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So a few more questions that we've had. One question that I think I neglected to emphasize was about the Medicaid restriction. And so, let me just recap that really quickly. Earlier versions of this text had a provision prohibiting any organization that receives Medicaid, that's eligible for Medicaid reimbursements from participating in the 7A, the Paycheck program. We were continually alarmed to see that in draft after draft, that Medicaid provision was still in there. But ultimately, according to drafts we saw and people, we spoke with at the highest levels of the Small Business Committee, that language was struck rather late in the afternoon, the night that a deal was announced. So the Medicaid prohibition is not in this text. The prohibition on organizations eligible for Medicaid reimbursements is not in this bill. The last minute addition that some might say replaced it was this underlining and making explicit that the SBA's affiliation rules do apply. I think people could try to think about maybe national nonprofit organization for whom those affiliation rules apply that would still be ineligible for this program without carving out all Medicaid recipient organizations. So that is how that landed. The 500 employee limit, much to our chagrin for the 7A program, is still in there. And that's why that, some of the payroll tax relief provisions or the Treasury Department subsidized loans are of great importance for nonprofit organizations larger than. So a few other questions, and Anna, I'd say if you've seen questions in the chat too, feel free to plug them in here in the couple minutes that we have remaining. I would note that in addition to making these slides available with the webinar recording, Independent Sector will be publishing, before midnight tonight, later today, a longer, more detailed summary of this $2 trillion bill that we could not fit onto 15 slides. So please stay tuned for that as well. We have another question about the direct assistance checks. People who are about eligibility again, are these checks only for people who have Social Security numbers, or anyone with tax IDs eligible for them?
Just can you answer that question? So we have a TIN versus a Social Security number?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I know that for how the language is worded as U.S. residents, I believe you need a Social Security number. I'll have to check on whether another number will suffice in its place. I believe so, but I'll double check on that.
Great. Okay. We've had one question about, could the House be persuaded to increase the universal deduction caps? And I think the answer to that is that not on this bill. There will not be changes accepted to this very delicately negotiated, hotly contested compromise. But as we look to further legislation, I think that will absolutely be a focal point of IS, and anyone who wants to continue to work with us on that. We have seen Congressman Moulton in the House of Representatives from Massachusetts express an interest in championing sort of nonprofit specific legislation or provisions in a fourth bill. I think that increasing the caps will be part of that. I think many people would also be closely watching the 6, I believe, senators, including Senator Langford, who offered the amendment in the Senate to increase those caps. So here's a question for Washington Council back in the SBA piece. Is there funding that would support small businesses from defaulting on rent or loan payments and to support employees that would be administered by community nonprofits? Have you all heard of any money, sort of to go to nonprofits to help support individuals in need in their communities? We've seen some direct assistance, but I'm not sure I've, seen anything about nonprofits as sort of financial relief intermediaries, if I'm reading this question properly.
Yeah, you have the 7A loan program through the banks. You have the disaster loan program and the grants through SBA, and then that's kind of quick money out the door. At least the grants are through SBA for $10,000, and then you have the loan program through 7A, which would be forgiven portion for your payroll and your rent. You could go for paying your rent as a nonprofit, but not for other people's rent. Nothing that I know of comes off the top of my head. There is some programs within the SBA that help supports nonprofits, give technical assistance and guidance to organizations or other small businesses, not directly for assistance to meet their rent payments or otherwise. Nothing comes to mind that jumps out at me that in the bill. Other programs, that could be funded under the appropriation side could maybe access some of that funds, but I don't really.
Okay. And then I think this will be our last question before we have to close. This is a question from Aaron. If we are part of a group 501c3 exemption, can we apply independently for the $10,000 emergency economic injury grant? Do we have to have been in business for more than, say, 15 months to be eligible? Anything along those lines that you can share with us, Washington Council?
I think for the disaster loans and the grants, you had to be in business, I think, as of this year.
Okay.
So there's no requirement much beyond that.
Okay.
As long as you're in business, I think earlier this year, January, February, you're okay. Okay, great. So I'm trying to think what else.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and if you're part of a group, there was, as I mentioned, the attribution rules, the 7A program would apply. And so, if you wanted to apply and if someone controlled your organization, then they would have to be included in that 500 employee.
Okay. We are at 3:00, and I know that everyone has a lot of obligations. I'm looking really quickly here. Someone's asking when the longer article is going to be published. We're editing it right now. So hopefully by 5 o'clock, it'll be a resource in the policy section of our website. Also, I would say watch the IS Twitter feed. Question about the $300 deduction per organization or from a single taxpayer. This is maximum of $300 for that tax unit. So it's not a $300 deduction to each of 10 different organizations. It's only one maximum $300 deduction. And with that, I think we will close down for now, given that we are past 3 o'clock. Did just want to see if there are any quick ones we can answer briefly. Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, for your ongoing partnership, and certainly for all of everyone's work on this particular provision. When that bill gets signed into law, our communities will still be hurting. Our sector will still need a lot of public policy help, but we're really gratified by the support for the nonprofit sector that's in this bill, and I'm glad to be working with all of you on it. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.